Well, hi, everyone, and welcome to this special session where we're talking together about assisted suicide and euthanasia. And I'm delighted to be joined by Professor John Wyatt. John, great to see you.
Hi, thanks very much. It's great to be here.
John, just tell us a little bit about your background, your career, what you've been involved in over the last few decades, which that's a bit of a pointed comment, isn't it? What a way to start.
Yeah, you're making me sound like a very old man, which of course I am. I've been involved as a medic, primarily as a paediatrician, working in central London for 25, 30 years. And it was during that time that I got more and more interested and concerned about the whole issue of medical ethics, and particularly how to respond from an orthodox Christian perspective. And I've now retired from the clinical front line, but I'm still very involved in all the debates going on about medical ethics. So this particular issue is very close to my heart.
Of course, the particular issue presently in front of us is that of assisted suicide. And the reason we're having this conversation is because there are now two assisted suicide bills, one at Westminster, Baroness Molly Meacher's bill, which is a private member's bill in the House of Lords. And then we've also got a bill lodged at the Scottish Parliament as well by Liam MacArthur, who's an MSP up in Orkney. Just thinking about the issue, first of all, we'll come on to the details of both of those bits of legislation in a moment. But let's just start with a very kind of simple but important question. The language that gets used in this debate is different. You and I will talk about assisted suicide, whereas a group like Dignity in Dying will talk about assisted dying. So what do we mean by those terms? And is there a difference between them?
Well, I think it's absolutely right to focus first on the language, because it's very significant that right from the very beginning, the debates about mercy killing have always used euphemistic or misleading language. And in fact, the very word euthanasia was invented by those advocates in favor of it because it literally means good death. But in practice, it means intentional killing by a doctor of somebody whose life is thought to be not worth living. And what we're talking about in this so-called assisted dying bill is the intentional ending of a life of somebody who isn't dying, of somebody who's actually, okay, they may have some kind of terminal condition, but the idea is that a doctor should work out what the lethal dose of particular medications is, and then should prescribe those and make those available to a person and make sure that they take the medication rightly. So the whole intention is to end life. And it's not too surprising that those who want to advocate for this have chosen deliberately this rather misleading term, assisted dying, which sounds so friendly and so nice. But actually what is being proposed is helping somebody to end their life, which of course, assisting a suicide at the moment is a serious criminal offence. In fact, you can go to prison for 14 years for assisting someone else to end their life. So what is being proposed is that under certain circumstances, doctors should be allowed to help other people kill themselves.
It's such a key point that you've made here. I mean, it's fascinating to me that the big pro euthanasia lobby group in the UK, which people watching you may have heard of, Dignity in Dying, changed their name because they were formerly called the Voluntary Euthanasia Society. And they recognized that the power of language, the deception that you can create just by tweaking the words that you use, very, very effective. You talked there about how, this isn't something that's just, as it were, friendly and soft sounding. This is actually quite a radical shift. Doctors being permitted to help patients kill themselves. That's another really important point, because sometimes I think in this debate, one side tries to suggest this is just a small tweak, whereas you're suggesting actually this is a radical shift in terms of how we approach medical care, right?
That's absolutely right. And as you say, the strategy of those who want to promote the law is to just say, well, doctors are helping people to die every day of their life, so all we're doing is just regularizing the law. But I'm afraid that is completely false. And it's very important to understand that the drugs that are used and the strategies that are used in this case of helping people to kill themselves are completely different from the drugs that are used by palliative care doctors. So when doctors are providing palliative care at the end of life, their intention is not to kill, and therefore they choose drugs which are not dangerous. But the drugs that are used by the doctors who are aiming to end life is a completely different set of drugs. They're drugs designed to instantaneously or as rapidly as possible create a very deep unconsciousness and stop the heart, stop the muscles of breathing, and bring death rapidly and cleanly. And it's very apparent just in the choice of drugs what the intention of the doctors are.
One of the things that has always sort of amazed me about this debate is how supportive and how friendly the media seem to be in terms of, perhaps I'm coming at it from the point of view of trying to place articles and opinions from our side in the mainstream press and just running up against all manner of obstacles again and again and again. Why do you think the media is so supportive? And I suppose if we can avoid it becoming a sort of BBC bashing exercise, because that's the easy thing. That's what I do, just bash the BBC. They're liberal, metropolitan and stuff. But actually, there must be something deeper going on, because it's all of the media seem to be totally on board with this.
Yeah, it is fascinating. You're right, as a phenomenon. And I've had the privilege of talking to a whole number of journalists and campaigners about this, and they give a uniform story, and that is, this is a fait accompli. It is going to happen. They trace a straight line in the liberalisation of law as they see it, and it starts in the 1960s with anti-discrimination legislation, divorce law reform, homosexual law reform, and abortion law reform. And they say, these processes are absolutely irreversible. There's a straight line going on, and it's going to happen. It might happen this year, it might happen next year, it might happen in 5 years' time, but it's going to happen. And given that, they then go on to say, would you rather be the person who Canute like King Canute, at the side of the water, is desperately holding it back, and you devote your career to being King Canute? Or would you prefer to be someone who's on the cutting edge of history, who's far-sighted, who's seeing the way it's going, and who's a prophetic voice saying this is the future of our society? So I think that's basically it. This extraordinary view that history is entirely sort of mapped out. And now, of course, that is completely questionable. History is not like that. These things are not fait accompli. There have been many, many examples of remarkable changes in attitudes in the past, including Christian revivals and changes and so on. But we shouldn't buy this idea that this is a fait accompli, but nonetheless, that's the view which particularly the mainstream journalists and the commentators and thinkers generally, that's what they buy into.
It's so fascinating. Just this morning, I was saying to a colleague on the phone on my way into the office that the narrative that this is just inevitable is one that needs to be challenged, because if you're an MP or an MSP and you're getting that message from Dignity in Dying and from the media, I mean, how, as you said, I mean, for your average MP who might not have strong views or expertise on the intricacies of this debate, they probably don't want to be King Canute. That's probably deeply unattractive to them. And it's just easier to go along with it, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And therefore, we do need to understand, one, that it's not inevitable, but two, why this is such a critical issue. Because once you introduce some form of medical killing into practice, into medical practice, it will completely transform the nature of medicine. I really don't think I'm overstating that. And of course, the obvious example is what happened to obstetrics and gynecology once abortion was legalized. Those of us who've worked closely in the field of obstetrics, as I have, know that once abortion became widespread and practiced, the attitudes of all the doctors within within obstetrics and gynecology changed, and their attitude to pregnancy changed because of the existence of abortion. Now, that only had an impact within this relatively small field of obstetrics and gynecology. The rest of medicine has carried on in a traditional way of saying we do not kill people. Killing people is wrong. It's not part of medical care. It's not something we're trained to do. It's not something we believe in. But there's no doubt that once you introduce some form of medical killing into general medical practice, that will affect every department in the hospital, because virtually every department in the hospital deals with people at the end of life. And therefore, the possibility of assisting suicide is there, and it will have to be discussed. Once you have that option, this is the way that the legal system works. I, as a doctor, could be sued if I didn't tell you that you had the option of ending your life. Because you could come back 3 months later and say, I've gone through 3 months of agony completely unnecessarily because you failed to tell me.
And I mean, just on that specific point, you know, the pressure that will then come on every hospital department, every form of kind of medicine. I mean, you look at what's happened in other countries, you look at what's happening right now in places like Canada, for example, and that is pretty much what you see happening again and again and again. So just paint a kind of picture here of where are the places around the world where this has already been legalized, and what are the kind of general trends that we see happening?
Yeah, well, there are a whole number of countries that have legalized different versions of medical killing. I mean, it's interesting how there isn't one standard version. So the Netherlands was one of the first places to legalize medical killing. But in the Netherlands, it took on a particular form, which was that it was the doctor's duty to stop suffering. And if the patient had what they called hopeless unbearable suffering, the doctor had a legal duty to step in and end the life. So it was all based around suffering. And what's happened in the Netherlands is that now medical killing has become pretty routine, particularly in conditions like cancer. Large numbers of people end their lives with a doctor injecting a lethal injection. And it's actually other issues in the Netherlands. It's like, you know, should we be killing people with dementia? Should we be killing people with severe mental illness, which is happening, people with depression and anorexia nervosa and personality disorders even? And should we be killing minors, with young children with cancer? Should we be killing newborn babies with brain damage? So this is spreading and changing attitudes. And as you say, Canada is another place where the Supreme Court in Canada changed the rules just back 2015, 2016. And to begin with, there was quite a lot of resistance from the medical profession. But once it became legalized, a small number of doctors started practicing killing people and their patients. And this has just steadily increased. And is now, the doctors have run training courses to help doctors to learn how to kill people cleanly and neatly. They have care pathways where you can work out if someone's got a terminal illness, when do they qualify? And it's happening within some palliative care units. There's been huge pressure on palliative care doctors to participate. And so it's all becoming regularized. And I think Canada is a much closer model to what would actually happen here in the UK, because once this entered into the NHS, then there has to be, well, we can't have a postcode lottery. I mean, why should somebody be able to be killed or help to be killed in London, but not in Huddersfield? So we've now got to institute national program, national training, legal safeguards, and so on. And of course, the other thing is that the law has been repeatedly challenged by new and difficult cases. And I suspect that's going to happen again here.
It sort of becomes like an industry of death. It almost becomes commercialized in a sense of how can we do mercy killings better, more efficiently, more effectively, and it's that whole slippery slope thing that you just see. That actually, to me, is the thing that strikes me the most. You know, why is it, do you think, that from our point of view we have so many arguments that logically stack up? We can point to Netherlands, Canada, Oregon State, Washington State, Belgium, Switzerland. You see rising numbers, incremental expansion of categories of eligibility, assisted suicide, euthanasia becoming normalized people who have wrong diagnoses, having their life prematurely ended. You see all of that. You say that you see all of that. You point to the evidence, and yet poll after poll after poll shows mass public support. What's going on? What's behind this?
Well, and it's important to realize that there are two fundamental arguments behind this. And actually, those arguments are very powerful. And they're arguments for which we as Christians can see the force. I think it's really important to see this. Of course, there is a very malign and very frightening aspect behind this. But the fundamental arguments, the two arguments, are first of all the argument from compassion, and secondly, the argument from choice, or to use a technical term, autonomy. So if you take the first case, and this is repeatedly happens, and the argument is, look, the reality is, whatever your ethics say, the reality is that there are people in this country who are dying in a terrible state. They're crying out in agony. They're unsupported. It's a horrific prospect. And, we hear these stories being constantly repeated in the media. And the argument goes, well, look, we must have compassion on these people. I mean, we wouldn't allow a dog to die in this terrible state. So why on earth should we allow precious human beings, loved ones, our own loved ones, to be dying in this terrible state? And of course, as a Christian, we see the real force of that God is a God of compassion, and he calls us, his people, to act with compassion. And so that argument is very powerful. And the second argument is the argument from choice, which says, in a modern society, I have the right to choose where I live, who I marry, where I work, how I spend my money, how I spend my time. The one thing that I'm not allowed to choose is how and when I die. And they say, this is ridiculous. This is the 21st century. Of course, I must have the right and the choice to choose when I live. And again, that's a powerful argument, because as Christians, we too believe in choice. Our God is a God who says that Jesus is going to set us free. And we want to encourage people to be free, for their lives to flourish and for them to fulfill their potential. So those two arguments, compassion, freedom, and choice, are powerful arguments, and they resonate with a lot of people today.
It's just so woven into where our culture's at, that what you said there about choice and autonomy, that's the big idol of our time, isn't it? And again, it ties in with what you said before about this idea of it's a fait accompli. We have choice about those other areas of our life. How much of it do you think as well is there's just a widespread fear of death, and a widespread fear of suffering, full stop? Doesn't matter, I read recently, secular kind of philosophers, as it were, they see suffering as an interruption, but nothing more than that. How much does that kind of play into it as well?
No, absolutely right. So we've developed a society that believes that suffering is entirely negative. It's evil, it's destructive, it has no positive value. And of course, the dominant philosophy of utilitarianism, which says maximize happiness for the maximum people, views pain and suffering as the ultimate evil. We must do everything possible to eradicate suffering. Interestingly, all except there's one place in modern life when suffering is actually not like that, and that's in the gym or the sports field. When we say no pain, no gain, feel the burn, get in there, struggle, suffer. So when it comes to sport and physical fitness, the zeitgeist says, oh yeah, suffering's good. But in the rest of life, suffering is just completely pointless, and to just avoid it. Go through your life, anesthetize yourself from anything at all unpleasant. And of course, fear of death and fear of the dying process. What many people say is, I'm not actually that frightened about death, but I am frightened of the dying process. I don't want to think about unpleasant things happening. I want to control. There's a famous, poster from an early pro-euthanasia campaign in the Netherlands. It showed this chap getting into a coffin with a suit and tie on, and it said underneath, everyone has the right to die like a gentleman. But it's this idea, that I want to die in control. I want to die in dignity. I want it all to be clean and humane. And the best way to do that is for the doctors to do it for me.
But look, as someone who's sitting here talking with you right now, suffering from the pain of physical exercise just recently, and of course, we've all had quite a sedentary lifestyle recently because of various lockdowns. So no doubt lots of people watching and listening are aware of that bizarre contradiction that you've highlighted. No pain, no gain, we say on the football pitch. And yet the death thing's really interesting, because we spoke with Dr. Catherine Mannix a few months ago. And one of the things that just kind of blew my mind as I listened to her was she just talked very calmly and very clearly about what death actually frequently looks like in a hospital setting. And it was the polar opposite of how it's presented in, soaps and in the media. And, what she was sharing was that actually very often families at bedsides don't even realize that their loved one has died, because it's so peaceful. And that's not trying to minimize the cases where that doesn't happen, but it was a completely different slant on it. How much are we being shaped by how the media portrays death and dying, and how much is it just our complete unwillingness to actually engage with planning for a good death? There's an old-fashioned idea, planning for a good death.
Yeah, and it's a complex topic. The truth is that many people do die very peacefully with good care, either in a hospital or in a hospice, or in a home with proper palliative care support. And the truth is that the UK actually leads the world in care of the dying, in palliative care. It doesn't always feel like that, but it is the truth. And that's thanks to these wonderful pioneers, Cicely Saunders and others, nearly all of whom were Christians, who pioneered a whole new way of caring for dying people. But it is also true that there are some cases of people who die in severe distress, and there are a number of reasons why that is. And the most troubling one to me is that I'm afraid a significant number of people in our society die in distress because of failures of care. The expertise is out there. There are people, the right medications, the right expertise, the right resources are out there, but it's actually very patchy. And there are many places in the NHS, many places in our society where actually there's very poor provision for dying people. It's very under-resourced. It's this kind of Cinderella area of the NHS. A lot of it's done by voluntary, the hospices are supported by voluntary donations and so on. So sadly, some people die in deep distress just because of failures of care. And that, I think, is absolutely outrageous, because, we invest in the NHS huge sums of money into new expensive treatments for cancer, some of which can only prolong life by tiny amounts, by a few weeks or a month or two. And yet people say, I really must have the latest expensive cancer treatment. But we don't give anything like the same resources to care of the dying. Palliative care, and so I think that's really bad. But there's another important point, and that is that what Cicely Saunders and the other specialists in palliative care pointed out was that pain at the end of the life is not just physical pain. There are other kinds of pain. There's quite often psychological or mental pain, where people are in quite mental distress and anguish. They're not in physical pain, but there's deep depression or anxiety or anguish. There's often relational pain. As someone approaches death, it's often the broken relationships which really cause people immense distress. And then there's spiritual pain. And often people feel guilty about the past. They feel their life has been pointless and worthless. They're worried, am I going to meet my maker? Am I going to be judged for my evil things I've done? And so what we find as those who care for the dying people is that actually treating the physical pain is the easiest kind of pain. The difficult pain to treat is psychological pain, relational pain, and spiritual pain. So when we hear these stories of people crying out in agony, my experience is nearly always this is not physical pain. These are people crying out in agony for other reasons. And large amounts of painkillers and morphine and tranquilizers doesn't work, because you need other kinds of care to help people mend broken relationships and to give the kind of spiritual support of pastoral care, helping people to understand and find forgiveness and so on. So this is why helping people to die well has to be holistic. It's not just a question of using certain drugs. It's providing psychological, relational, and spiritual support.
And I guess it comes back to the Christian worldview, which understands that we are not just physical beings, that there's a whole other realm, as it were. And so if you come at it from that vantage point, you'd expect there to be different types of suffering, not just physical. And I guess the other thing that I'm struck by is, something we've tried to do at CARE, and I think we could do better, is in this particular debate to not just be opposing assisted suicide and euthanasia, but to kind of advocate for the things that you've just talked about: a holistic approach to end of life care, proper investment, given that we're all going to die, whereas not everyone is going to get cancer. Wouldn't we be better to spend some of that money on making sure everyone has access to quality end of life care? And that must be just a political decision that governments have made over time.
Yes, it is. But, the interesting thing is it's ultimately about the general public, because the general public, there's a huge lobby pushing for cancer treatments. Billions of pounds is given to cancer research, billions of pounds to heart treatments. There's the British Heart Foundation and other, they're excellent organizations. They're really promoting very, very sophisticated research. But the amounts given in favor of these life-saving treatments is vastly in excess of the amounts given towards hospices and towards also just research and improving care. And I think it's outrageous, and it's because the general public don't realize how important this is. And actually, of course, it's the same thing about wills, isn't it? We don't want to make our wills. We don't want to make lasting power of attorney because it's all intimations of mortality. We'd much rather think about, new wonderful new treatments for cancer and heart disease. And yet the truth is that we do need to think about what it means to die well. And as a country, we need to make sure that we really are resourcing and providing the right kind of resources to help people to die well.
Let's this is so helpful and so much to kind of that we could talk about. But John, we want to help people to think about a Christian response to assisted suicide, assisted dying. But perhaps just first of all, I want to ask you, why is this so important? If you're a church leader, you've got 101 things that you're trying to do, plates that you want to keep spinning. We're all just coming out of successive lockdowns and dealing with all of the ramifications of that. And yet here, you and I are saying to church leaders, this matters, this is really important. And they're going, I've got lots of important things to worry about. So what would you say to a church leader? Why should they take this very, very seriously?
Well, of course, I do understand that church leaders and Christians generally sometimes feel as though there are so many challenges, so many issues in contemporary society, and how on earth, can I be concerned by everything? But I do genuinely believe that this issue to do with suicide and legalized killing is one of the absolute foundational parts about our societies. As one way of putting it is that a prohibition of suicide and of killing, medical killing, is part of the glue that binds society together. And actually, it's bound our society together all the way back into the Christian heritage. You can trace it all the way back into the era of the early Christian church and so on. That suicide, which in some ways has always been a pagan way to die, has been opposed by Christianity because of its destructive effects within community. And sadly, what is being proposed is almost to go back to the pagan era, a kind of rehabilitation that maybe killing yourself is a noble way to die, instead of being what Christians have always seen as being an act of hopelessness and despair and the destruction of a precious life. So I think there's little doubt that once some form of medicalized killing gets into a society, once it gets into the NHS, then there's a kind of irreversible process that will mean that a change in social attitudes towards death and dying, a change in attitudes toward the elderly and the vulnerable, And this is certainly what you can see in other societies where sadly some kind of legalized medical killing is already taking place. And perhaps the other thing just to say that is that there's a global perspective in this, and that is that the UK is regarded, rightly or wrongly, by many countries as a kind of gold standard when it comes to medical law and regulation. And the fact that we as a UK have resolutely stood against medical killing, whereas other places like the Netherlands and Canada have gone in favour, many other countries have looked across and said, well, if the UK is refusing to go down this route, then we're going to follow them. Whereas I think it's pretty clear that once the UK went down this route, then basically medical killing will spread across the world, and that would be a tragedy. And I don't think it's a fait accompli. I think it's possible that the UK can hold the line and say this is not the route we want to go.
And of course, in 2015, when MPs last voted on an assisted suicide bill, and that bill was defeated by 330 votes to 118, and a quite remarkable second reading debate where MPs went into the chamber, decided to vote in favour of the bill, heard the speeches with the arguments against, and said, actually, I can't do that. I'm going to vote against it. That this is still winnable, and it was thanks in part to the incredible efforts of churches and Christians from many different denominations that wrote to their MP, engaged with their MP, and did all of that. And we'll come on to that in a second. I just want to arrow in, as it were, on thinking through theologically, from a Christian biblical perspective, what is a right response. So we've talked about the importance of this issue. And you've written before about how a Christian response to assisted suicide must begin with creation. Could you just unpack what do you mean by that?
Yeah, so the whole point is about what it means to be human, and what is the significance of a human life, and what is so clear in those foundational chapters in the Bible, but of course throughout the whole of the scriptures, is that human beings are unique because of the image of God, because as it has been put, each human life is not just a gift that God has given. It is, of course, a gift, but it's also a reflection of his character. And therefore, the intentional destruction of any human life, however reduced, however filled with disability or seemingly insignificance, in some way is to spit in the face of the Creator. It is an offense in the sight of God. And we see this very clearly in Genesis chapter 9, as evil is spreading and accelerating through society after the fall. This ancient legal statute, which is called the lex talionis, which is basically arguing for capital punishment. And it says, those who shed the blood of man, by man shall their blood be shed. But the important thing is that it goes on why that's the case, why capital punishment. And it's there in the scriptures. It says, because in the image of God has God made man. In other words, it's the image of God which indicates the profound preciousness of human life. And that's why not just homicide, the intentional killing of human beings, is always wrong, but also suicide. To destroy my own life is an act of despair and hopelessness, but it's also to say to God, you're wrong. My life is not valuable. My life is not significant. My life is worthless. And we have no right to say that to God about our own life, just as much as we have no right to say about others. So we start then from creation with the image of God, but then I think it's really important to hold the other great creation principles, and one of those is that we're made out of dust. We're made out of the stuff of the earth, and that means that in God's creation design, we are designed to be vulnerable, frail, and dependent. And it's really important to note that this is nothing to do with the fall. This is about creation. This is the way that God chose to make us. Presumably he could have chosen to make us powerful and dynamic and and like the cherubim and the seraphim, who's in the temple, in Isaiah's temple, the whole temple is shaking with their voice. Well, they were created beings, and God could have created us like that, but instead he chose to create us out of dust, to make us frail and vulnerable and contingent. And it's fascinating that we come into this world utterly and totally dependent on the love and care of others. We go through a phase in our life when other people depend on us, but then most of us are going to end our lives utterly and totally dependent on the love and care of others. And the important thing is that this is not some terrible, evil, outrageous thing as it's often presented. No, this is part of the plan. This is part of the narrative of a human life.
One thing that we did recently at CARE was we asked our supporters to send in stories of their experiences at perhaps caring for loved ones, or even their own experience of living with a terminal illness. And one of the things I found most moving in their accounts that we received back was a common thread of the fact that there was redemption that was found even in the midst of that suffering. There was purpose found. There was reconciliation between husbands and wives, between mothers and daughters, sons and fathers, because they went through a season where someone was dependent upon them, just as they had been dependent upon them previously, and it led to peace and a deepening of relationship. And you and I have spoken before about the fact that if the law was to change, then all of a sudden the whole manner and nature of death becomes that much more artificial, and some of that raw emotion and reality is changed. How would legalized assisted killing change the sort of process of death, thinking of family and relatives and then the person themselves? What would you say about that?
Yes, no, I think that's absolutely the case, because at the moment, however reduced and limited my life is, however elderly I get, I don't need to provide a reason for continuing to live. It's just accepted that as long as I have life, I will be looked after, I will be cared for, and however many days ahead I have. But once there's an option to end your life, then the next question is, well, why aren't you taking it? I mean, do you really want to carry on living? And so all of a sudden, I've got to come up with a reason for why I should carry on, because there's an option now available. You don't need to carry on. You don't need to carry on this suffering. You don't need to carry on with your disabled life. There's an option. And of course, we know many, many people, and paradoxically, they're particularly in the Christian community, who are terrified about the prospect of becoming a burden to somebody else. I know elderly relatives of myself who just say, I'm very happy to care for other people. I'm very happy to look after other people, but I just don't want to be a burden. And if I ever become a burden to someone else, then I just want to say to the Lord, thanks very much. I want to go to heaven now. Well, at the moment, I have the right to say to them, well, you're wrong. You're designed to be a burden to me, and I'm designed to be a burden to you. That's the way God made it. And I think that's absolutely right. The problem is if this nice doctor comes and says, well, you don't have to be a burden. You can just sign this form and I'll help you to end your life. And then you won't be a burden to your relatives. And you can see how actually that will become a great temptation for people. Perhaps that's the right thing to do. Perhaps God is helping me to end my life. And so in this subtle way, suicide and the idea that might be a best way to end your life starts to enter into. And I think that's the great concern. Yes, there are a small number of people who are desperate to have the right to kill themselves. But if the law is changed to accommodate these people, what is going to be the consequences for the thousands and thousands of elderly and vulnerable people in our society who will now have to find a reason for why they're not ending their lives?
And it kind of plays upon, we all have insecurities, don't we? We all have doubts about our worth that we grapple with, and they get stronger at different periods, but they're strongest when we are often at our weakest. And so you totally agree. You can just see the the pressure, the covert pressure, the under the radar pressure that's going to fall upon all these people. John, what you've said about being a burden, being dependent, and from a Christian point of view, cuts against so much of what our society thinks and the attitude our society has. But as Christians, we're called to fix our eyes upon Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith. And so how important do you think from a Christian point of view is it that of course Jesus himself experienced the very same dependence that I mean, it just kind of blows your mind, doesn't it? Jesus was a baby who relied upon Mary and Joseph to feed him, help him, care for him, and so on. How important is that in terms of the Christian response to assisted suicide?
No, I think it's absolutely central. And, you know, we're so familiar with the story of Christmas, with the story of the incarnation, that actually we've forgotten how utterly scandalous and even offensive it is, you know, that the idea of the God of supreme authority and control, the God whose word is obeyed across the entire cosmos, that God should choose to turn himself into a baby, and not just some idealized cherub, but a real physical baby who has a pain in his tummy and who vomits and squirts down his mother's back, who needs to have his bottom wiped, who's fed on a breast. I mean, it's not surprising that to the ancient philosophers, this was just bizarre and offensive and ridiculous. And yet that is the heart of the Christian message, that God enters into the human experience. And of course, at the end of his life on the cross, of his human life, he's there with his arms outstretched, the God of total power and authority on the cross, and through parched lips, that God states, I am thirsty. And he can do nothing for himself. He has made himself, he has chosen to become utterly and totally dependent on others. And yet, what the Christian faith teaches us is at that moment of total dependence, he is still the second person of the Trinity, upholding the universe by the word of his power. So his divine status and dignity is in no way touched by his dependence. And that seems to be an incredibly important message, because that's true of us too. You know, if, as is quite likely, you and I will both end our lives in a hospital bed, utterly and totally dependent on the love and care of others, having to be fed and washed and have our bottoms wiped, our unique status and dignity as beloved princes and princesses of the Most High is in no way touched, because Jesus has been there before us. He's shown us what it means. And so there is a uniquely Christian take on all this. Yes, we of course can unite with other people who are opposed to medical killing, to people from the Orthodox Jewish faith, from the other Abrahamic religions, from Islam, and secular people who are opposed to medical killing and so on. But there is a unique and wonderful take from a Christian perspective that there of a mystery of dependence, which I find very, very moving.
One of the things that's been said by some within the Christian community who believe that assisted suicide is right and compassionate is that there's nothing holy about suffering. And I must confess, John, like you, I come at things from a very honest, I hope, evangelical perspective. I find it utterly staggering that anyone within the Christian community could say those words. There's nothing holy about suffering. How would you respond to such a notion, given what you've just said about Christ and suffering?
Well, you know, the whole zeitgeist sees suffering as completely futile and pointless and even destructive, and to be avoided at all costs. And the philosophy of utilitarianism, which is very, very influential in the secular world, particularly in the world of science and technology, basically says that all pain and all suffering is the ultimate evil, and that human life is all about pleasure, and it's all about maximizing pleasure and minimizing suffering. It's just interesting, isn't it, that there's one place where that doesn't apply, and that's on the sports field or in the gym, where we all know that no pain, no gain. And actually we celebrate those who go through feel the burn, and endurance athletes who go through absolute hell in order to win the prize. So in the context of sport and the gym, suffering is absolutely essential in order to progress. But in the rest of life, in the secular world, suffering is seen as utterly to be avoided. Now, of course, Christianity takes a much more nuanced position here. Yes, suffering should be minimized if it can be. We're not masochists. We try and avoid suffering if we can, but we recognize, and as just Jesus recognized in Gethsemane, that there are times when it is our calling. But the whole point is that God's plan is not to abolish suffering in this age, but it is to redeem it. It is to bring blessing and healing out of evil and pain. And there's the mystery. There's a mystery in suffering. Yes, as a medic, I am fully in favor of using all the techniques we have of pain control, and it's wonderful how in palliative care we are able to control physical pain extraordinarily effectively. Of course, we're much less effective at controlling spiritual pain, relational pain, psychological pain, because these things don't respond to medical treatments. They need other means of support and care and compassion. But we, at the same time, we recognize that although suffering is uncomfortable, it's also the means by which God can use us. And there's this extraordinary statement, I just read it today in the New Testament in Philippians, where it says that God has given us the grace gift of not only believing in him, but suffering for his name's sake. So there, suffering for Jesus is far from seeing as a terrible evil, is actually a grace gift.
You speak about Philippians, there's that bit, isn't there, Philippians 3, where the Apostle Paul, speaking about the surpassing worth of knowing Christ over and above everything, he says he wants to know more fellowship in his sufferings, which is the very opposite of there's nothing holy about suffering. John, we've talked already as well about the kind of societal attitudes towards death. And many people watching this will know that Christianity has a lot to say about death, but you're keen to emphasize that there's a bit of a paradox in how Christianity views death. Could you just briefly explain what that paradox is, and how as Christians we should approach and understand death?
Yes, so it's a very interesting nuance that the Christian faith says about death. So on the one hand, it's absolutely clear that death is an enemy. In fact, it's described as the last enemy. And we're called to fight against death whenever we can. And I, as a medic, have spent decades of my life in an intensive care unit trying to hold back death. It's like death has been there trying to get hold of this little baby. And I've been using all the skill, all the ingenuity, all the endurance to just hold death away. And yet there are situations where by God's grace, death changes from an enemy into a strange kind of healing, or even into a gateway into the new heaven and the new earth. And so as a medic, as a Christian medic, we fight against death as an enemy while seeking to find the point at which we should take away our hands and allow death to occur. And so in that same way, we for all of us as Christians, we see death as an enemy, and it's right to hang on to life as much as possible, but to seek to find the point at which we should say enough is enough. It's now time for me to go into the next stage of my life. And therefore, although I think we never could say that we welcome death, because in that sense it's always an enemy, we accept it. There is such a thing as a good death. There is such a thing as a godly and a faithful death. And fascinatingly, in the New Testament, the New Testament authors very rarely use the phrase death when they're talking about Christian believers. They say that Jesus died in order that we might fall asleep. And that's because the sting of death has been taken by Jesus. Jesus really died on the cross. He experienced death in all its horror in order that we don't need to experience death in all its horror. What we do is we learn to fall asleep, and we fall asleep to wake to the face of Christ, and therefore the death of a believer is stripped by God's grace. That's not to sanitize it, not to say, of course, there is still, it's the valley of the shadow of death, and there is still suffering, but ultimately it is completely changed by this hope of meeting Jesus face to face.
One of the things, I guess I put this up because my dad, for most of his career, as it were, when he wasn't a minister, worked in publishing and would often publish books by dead people, Christian books by dead people, in particular a group called the Puritans. And one of the things they would say is that Christians should prepare for death. You shouldn't just sort of ignore it or pretend it's something to be put off. If we believe that, you know, God has appointed our time and he alone knows, we should prepare ourselves while we can. And I've always thought about that. I'm relatively young right now. The idea seems absurd, but do you think there's some wisdom in that as Christians we should prepare?
I do, absolutely. In fact, if I could say so, I wrote a book called Dying Well, which was exactly to help people prepare, and particularly for people facing death themselves. But the basic message of that book is that you need to do the preparation in advance. There's a wonderful tradition of the medieval church, which was called these self-help documents, which were circulating amongst the Christian population. And they were called the Ars Moriendi, which means the art of dying. And the interesting thing is they weren't intended for theologians and priests and so on. They were intended for ordinary lay people to help them to die in case, in an emergency, a priest was not available. And a modern equivalent title would be Dying for Dummies. And I thought that was such a wonderful title. I was trying to use it for my own book, but discovered because of copyright reasons I couldn't. But that idea that all of us need to be preparing ourselves. But, you know, there's a wonderful tradition that we could use what happens every night to practice dying, because that Simeon's words, after he'd met the baby Jesus in the temple, he said, "Lord, now let me depart in peace, because my eyes have seen your glory." In other words, it's safe for me to go to sleep because I've seen your glory. And that's why those words became part of the evening service in the Christian cycle of services. Lord, let me now depart in peace. And the idea is that every time we put our head on that pillow and we are practicing what it means to die in Christ, we are giving ourselves into his secure and compassionate love, so that when the eventual time comes, we know what it's like. We're ready for this. We've been here before.
John, you mentioned Dying Well, one of the books that you've written. There's another book that you wrote back in 2015 called Right to Die, which is, just from personal experience, one of the best and most accessible books I've read on the whole question of assisted suicide, euthanasia, Christian response. And you so helpfully talk about what are the drivers behind the kind of prevailing attitude in society, which we talked about earlier on in this conversation. And that's still available. You can still buy that. Where could people get hold of that if they wanted to?
Yes, you can buy that from IVP, from the IVP website. You can buy it from Eden or other well-known Christian bookshops. You can buy it from Amazon. It's widely available, both as an ebook or as a physical copy. Fantastic.
Another helpful resource as well is the website that you have, johnwyatt.com. John Wyatt, all one word, johnwyatt.com. And you're updating that on a regular basis, is that right?
Yes, I am. I'm trying to put up articles and material, both on this topic, but also on other topics like the coronavirus, vaccines, and technology, and other issues which you're facing. But I hope over the next few weeks and months to put up more material, particularly addressing this issue, both of why the assisted dying bill is wrong, but also positively. One of the great things that Cicely Saunders, who was the pioneer of palliative care, a wonderful Christian woman, she said, you don't have to kill the patient in order to kill the pain. And I want to spell that out a bit more. What does that actually mean? Why is that true? Because it is absolutely true. Yes, it's important to control pain, but we don't need to kill people in order to control pain. So I'll be putting up more articles on my website, and they're freely available.
Fantastic. And one of them, what's wrong with the assisted dying bill, you very kindly allowed us to publish it on the CARE website as well. So if you visit care.org.uk, and if you go to our assisted suicide cause section, you'll be able to find that article, which is so helpful at explaining what's wrong with Baroness Meach's assisted suicide bill, assisted dying bill, which is in the House of Lords. And John, I wonder if we could just wrap up this this conversation just by getting a bit practical. Someone's perhaps listened to this or watched this and wants to help, wants to play their part in pushing back against this attempt to change the law in England and Wales, and in Scotland as well. There's a bill up there too. Just briefly, what would your advice be for someone who wants to practically take action in this respect?
Yeah, thanks. I think the first thing, of course, is just to get informed and to really understand what the fundamental issues are, because there's so much misunderstanding, and it's often intentional. The reason this is called the assisted dying bill is deliberately, I'm afraid, to mislead and confuse. And I'm reminded of a proverb that says the beginning of wisdom is to call things by their proper names. So I think we need to understand what the issues are, get informed, but then you can make a difference. There are a number of organisations that are committed, including CARE, but also Care Not Killing is an organisation dedicated, not just Christians, but many other groups have come together in a coalition in order to oppose the assisted dying bill. You could join them and be involved in their activities, and you can write to your MP. And this has become very easy now in the pandemic era. There are websites available, and you can just type in your postcode. It'll tell you who your MP is. You click on them, you write a message, and MPs take this very seriously. If they get a message from their constituents, they will certainly respond. And it's certainly true that in the previous debates on euthanasia we've had in the Houses of Parliament, its MPs have said we have received more messages on this topic than on any other, and we have to take it seriously.
Fantastic. John, really do appreciate your time and all that you've shared. It's just been fantastic. I've loved listening as much as I've loved also offering some questions as well. So thank you so much. And johnwyatt.com again is that website address. John, thank you for your time.
Thanks very much, James. It's great to be here.
Lovely. Well, thank you as well to all of you for listening and for watching. For further information on everything that we've just talked about, do please visit care.org.uk, and you'll be able to find very easily on the homepage the assisted suicide cause page, which is just a wealth of information which will help you better understand what is going on in this area, what the new bill means, and how you can respond as well. So thank you to you for listening.